probably every one of you sitting here tonight has enjoyed a comic book or a graphic novel at some point in your life, if it was Spider-Man or Justice League or even Archie. Whichever you are reading isn't important, it's just important that you were reading. What's so wonderful about March is that it owes its existence to a comic book. That's right, Congressman John Lewis, as a young man, read a 1950s comic book called Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. And here it is. This comic is the account of the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott. It went unnoticed by the mainstream comic industry, but it spread like crazy among civil rights groups. This comic is over 60 years old and contributed to Congressman John Lewis, Andrew Iden, and Nate Powell creating the March trilogy. A comic book can be that amazing. As a one-book partner, we do so much more than just make the book available at our library locations. We will be hosting one-book events all throughout the season. The city's Pacific Beach Taylor branch will be holding a civil rights cinema, which will screen movies including Selma, Loving, and Mississippi Burning. Our Central Library in East Village is hosting legendary comics guru Scott McCloud, who will talk about comics and visual communications. But the San Diego Public Library is not the only organization to hold these events. Every single one-book partner has committed to creating a public event. North of the city of San Diego, the Escondido Public Library is hosting a sign-making workshop called What Would You March For? And the Oceanside Library will have a panel discussion on comic books. There are many more March activities planned at our library locations and other supporting library systems throughout San Diego County. So please check out kpbs.org/onebook to find an event near you. With all of the city's library locations, all the 33 San Diego County branches, which is also a partner, and other participating organizations, there will be more than 100 one-book events to attend this year. And that's incredible. So we hope to see you at one of these events, and we're very proud to be here tonight. Thank you.
Please welcome San Diego civil rights icon, Harold K. Brown.
Thank you very much. And good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure, really, to be here to share with you some remarks about the San Diego civil rights movement of the 1960s. While the freedom rides in the South, the boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, the sit-ins at lunch counters, the voter registration drives, and others that were taking place around the country, all aimed at breaking down the doors of racial segregation and discrimination. There was a city of sun and fun called San Diego, California, where the same battles against racial segregation and discrimination were being fought. San Diego, in the 1960s, practiced racial discrimination in housing, employment, education, and hotel and restaurant accommodations, just like in the South and other parts of America. Because of the existence of these practices, in 1960, a small group of us, blacks and whites, formed the San Diego chapter of the Congress of Racial Equality, known as CORE, a national civil rights organization. To address this treatment of San Diego's black citizens. At that time, blacks were forced to live in designated areas, as many of you know, in the city throughout San Diego. And the city had what we call restrictive covenants, which meant that Negroes, as we were called then, could not rent or buy in any of the other areas of the city. Schools were therefore segregated. Most businesses, except where government contracts existed, did not hire blacks. Banks, utility companies, brokerage companies, insurance companies, hotels, restaurants, newspapers and TV, jobs in those places were closed to blacks. Our core chapter, angry and determined to change those conditions, we picketed, set in, and marched against numerous companies and businesses to draw attention to their policies and practices of not hiring blacks. One business I often mention to emphasize the seriousness of job discrimination in San Diego was a food store that we picketed for months because they refused to hire blacks, even for the position of bagging groceries. We also demonstrated against the San Diego Zoo, the San Diego Union newspaper, the San Diego Real Estate Association, the San Diego Gas and Electric Company, and the Bank of America. Some of us were arrested and jailed during our demonstrations against the San Diego Gas and Electric Company and the Bank of America. As the chairman of CORE and the leader of the demonstrations, I received jail sentences from 3 different judges, totaling 125 days, with some days suspended. I was permitted to serve the time on weekends while teaching school during the week, introducing some magnanimity into this deplorable situation. Some might say our civil rights struggle in San Diego was lightweight compared to what Congressman Lewis and others went through in the South, and I agree. But nevertheless, it called for courage, conviction, and sacrifice by the demonstrators. There are 2 ways to look at the civil rights movement in America: the good and the bad. The good is that we have overcome a lot of the bad. San Diego is so much different a city than it was during the 60s. Conditions have changed for better for San Diego's black citizens and citizens of color. Thanks to the nationwide civil rights movement and our efforts in San Diego, much has been accomplished toward making America what most of us wish it to be. Because of the constraint of time, I did not go into more detail concerning the civil rights movement in San Diego. But if you are interested in knowing more, I cover it in more detail in a section of the book I have written, which I hope will be published in early 2019. You can also access electronically the Harold K. Brown Civil Rights and African American Experience Collection in the San Diego State University Library. I want to thank One Book, One San Diego for the opportunity to share with you a little about the civil rights movement in San Diego. And I thank all of you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Harold. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the trio responsible for March, the graphic novel trilogy that is Congressman John Lewis's firsthand account of African American struggle for equality. Congressman Lewis, the United States Representative from Georgia's 5th Congressional District, hardly needs an introduction. He is a renowned icon of the civil rights movement. As a young man in the 1960s, he organized peaceful protests of Nashville's segregated lunch counters and participated in famous freedom rides to desegregate buses in the South. As head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he became nationally recognized and named one of the Big Six in the civil rights movement. The peaceful protest he led across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma is known as a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement in history. The news footage and photographs of marchers being beaten by state troopers hastened the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Congressman Lewis was among those beaten with a billy club, and the confrontation became known as Bloody Sunday. He was elected to the United States House of Representatives in 1986 and has represented his district ever since. He was awarded the Medal of Freedom by President Barack Obama in 2011. Despite everything he has been through, Congressman Lewis still believes in nonviolent protests. Andrew Iden is an Atlanta native and serves as the Congressman's digital director and policy advisor. He was communications director and press secretary during the Congressman's re-election campaign in 2008 and again in 2010. Andrew is a longtime fan of comics, a hobby his mother encouraged him to pursue. Andrew discovered that the Congressman's civil rights journey had been influenced by the comic book Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. He encouraged the Congressman to write his own graphic novel about his role in the civil rights movement. The Congressman asked Andrew to write it with him. Andrew is a graduate of Trinity College and Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And Nate Powell was born in Little Rock, Arkansas. Nate is a New York Times best-selling graphic novelist. He began self-publishing at 14 and graduated from School of Visual Arts in 2000. His graphic novel, Swallow Me Whole, has won the Eisner Award, the Ignatz Award, and was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize. In addition to March, Nate is also an artist for the graphic novel adaptation of Rick Riordan's international bestseller, Heroes of the Olympus, The Last Hero. With March, these three men have created a phenomenon all of its own. It is the first graphic novel to receive the National Book Award. It's also the first graphic novel to receive the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. There are many other awards. Among the most notable are the Coretta Scott King Book Award and the Michael A. Prince Award. Much like Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story, Congressman Lewis said he hopes his own story told in a graphic novel format will guide future leaders. It is my great pleasure to introduce to the stage Congressman John Lewis, Andrew Iden, and Nate Powell.
Good evening. You're a good-looking group. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having us here tonight. Thank you for those kind words of introduction. I must tell you that we are delighted and very pleased to be here to talk about March, Book 1, it's Book 2, that's Book 3. One book, one San Diego. One book, one San Diego. Now, I didn't grow up in a big city like San Diego, or Los Angeles, or Washington, D.C., or Atlanta. I grew up in rural Alabama, 50 miles from Montgomery, outside of a little place called Troy. My father was a sharecropper, a tenant farmer. I grew up with 6 brothers and 3 sisters. Wonderful mother, wonderful father, wonderful grandparents, and wonderful great-grandparents. But I remember when I was only 4 years old, in 1944, my father had saved $300, and a man sold him 110 acres of land. My family still owns this land today. On this farm, we raised a lot of cotton, a lot of corn, peanuts, hogs, cows, and chickens. My 2 wonderful, smart colleagues have heard me say this so many times. They're probably sick of me saying it. I know you heard too much Andrew and Nate, but let's just reason and just talk a little tonight, okay?
You bet.
Is it okay? When I was growing up there on that farm, sometime I'd be out there working in the field, picking cotton, gathering peanuts, pulling corn as a little boy, as a little child. My mother would say, boy, you're falling behind, you need to catch up. And I would say, this is hard work. And she would say, hard work never kill anybody. I said, well, it's about to kill me. But growing up there, as a little child, I fell in love with raising chickens. Any of you know anything about raising chicken? Don't fool me, you don't know anything about raising chicken. I know some of you like to eat chicken, but you don't know anything about raising chicken. But let me tell you what I had to do as a little boy. When the setting hen was set, take the fresh eggs, mark them with a pencil, place them under the setting hen, and wait for 3 long weeks for the little chicks to hatch. Some of you may be saying, now, John Lewis, why do you mark those fresh eggs with a pencil before you place them under the setting hen? Well, from time to time, another hen would get on that same nest. And there would be some more fresh eggs. You had to be able to tell the fresh eggs from the eggs that were already under the setting hen. When the little chick would hatch, I would fool these setting hens. I would cheat on these setting hens. I would take the little chicks and give them to another hen and get some more fresh eggs, mark them with a pencil, place them under the setting hen, encourage the setting hen to stay in the nest for another 3 weeks. When I look back on it, it was not the right thing to do. It was not the moral thing to do. It was not the most loving thing to do. It was not the most nonviolent thing to do. But I kept on cheating on these setting hens because I was never quite able to save $18.98 to order the most inexpensive incubator from the Susan Roebuck store. Any of you old enough to remember the Susan Roebuck catalog? That big book, that heavy book, that thick book. Some people call it the wish book, or well, I wish I had this, I wish I had that. So I just kept on wishing. But as a little boy, I kept on fooling these setting hens and cheating on these setting hens. I wanted to be a minister. I wanted to preach the gospel. So from time to time, with the help of my brothers and sisters and cousins, we would gather all of our chickens together in the chicken yard. And I would preach to these chickens. And some of these chickens would bow their heads. Some of these chickens would shake their heads. They never quite said amen. But I'm convinced that those chickens that I preached to during the 40s and the 50s tended to listen to me much better than some of my colleagues listen to me today in the Congress. And some of these chickens were just a little more productive. At least they produce say, well, that's enough of that. But I tell you, if it hadn't been for the patience of those chickens and my sisters and brothers and cousins, I probably wouldn't be standing here today as a member of Congress, as someone who was inspired to get involved in the civil rights movement. My mother would say that I was very nosy growing up. I wanted to know everything. Asked too many questions. Why this? Why that? She said, boy, just be quiet. You get involved in grown folks' business. But growing up there, when we would visit the little town of Troy, visit Montgomery, visit Tuskegee, I saw those signs that said white men, colored men, white women, colored women, white waiting, colored waiting. And I would ask, why? She would say, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way, don't get in trouble. In 1955, 15 years old in the 10th grade, I heard of Rosa Parks. I heard the words of Martin Luther King Jr. on the radio. The action of Rosa Parks, the words and leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. inspired me to find a way to get in the way. So in 1956, with some of my brothers and sisters and cousins, we went down to the public library. The public library. Trying to get library card, trying to check out some books. And we were told by the librarian that the libraries were whites only and not for coloreds. I never went back to that library until July 5th, 1998, for a book signing of my first book, Walking with the Wind. And I tell you, I was so blessed that in 1968, to marry a librarian who was born in Los Angeles, attended UCLA and USC Graduate School of Library Science. So I love librarians. I love books. With books, we can travel, we can learn, we can see the world, we can be inspired. So when Andrew Iden suggested to me that maybe I should write a comic book, and so maybe he wouldn't give up. He wouldn't take no for an answer. He had read this book, the comic book, heard me talk about it, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Montgomery story, and he just kept saying, Congressman, you should write a comic book. Write your own comic book. And I finally said, yes, if you do it with me. And book 1 and book 2, the result of this young man urging me, and I'm glad I said yes. So I'm honored to be here with Andrew Iden and Nate Powell. These two smart, gifted young men. They're making a contribution that generation yet unborn will be inspired by what they continue to do. Now, some of you may ask, how did you get involved in the civil rights movement? How did you meet Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks? In 1957, when I was only 17 years old, I wrote a letter to Dr. King. I didn't tell my mother, my father, any of my sisters or brothers, any of my teachers. I wanted to attend a little college about 10 miles from my home called Troy State College. It is now known as Troy University, probably one of the fastest growing universities in America. Students come from all over America and from all over the world to attend college there. Submitted my application, my high school transcript. I never heard a word from the school. So I wrote a letter to Dr. King. I didn't tell my mother, didn't tell my father, any of my sisters or brothers, any of my teachers. Dr. King wrote me back and sent me a round-trip Greyhound bus ticket and invited me to come to Montgomery to meet with him. In the meantime, I was accepted at a little college in Nashville, Tennessee. An uncle of mine gave me a $100 bill, gave me a Foot Locker. You know, the young people here, do you know what a Foot Locker is? One of those big trunks that you can pull it open, bring it back together. I put everything that I own, my few books, my clothing, everything except those chickens in that Foot Locker, and took a Greyhound bus to Nashville, Tennessee to study. And after being in Nashville, Tennessee for about 3 weeks, I told one of my teachers that I'd been in contact with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and this teacher informed Dr. King that I was there. Martin Luther King Jr. got back in touch and suggested when I was home for spring break to come and see him. So on a Saturday morning, I boarded the bus, traveled from Troy to Montgomery, only 50 miles away. A young lawyer by the name of Fred Gray, who had been the lawyer for Rosa Parks and for Dr. King and the Montgomery movement, met me at the Greyhound bus station and drove me to the First Baptist Church, passed by the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and ushered me into the pastor's study. I saw Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy standing behind the desk. And Dr. King said, "Are you John Lewis? Are you the boy from Troy?" And I said to Dr. King, "I am John Robert Lewis." And he still called me the boy from Troy. He told me what could happen. He said, you know, we may have to file a suit against the state of Alabama, against Troy State, but if you want to go, we will support you. I went back and had a discussion with my mother and my father. They were so afraid. They thought we would lose the land, our home would be bombed or burned. So I continued to study in Nashville. So it was in Nashville, Tennessee, that I would see Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from time to time, or see Rosa Parks, or Mrs. Coretta Scott King when they came to speak. And they would always ask, "How you doing? How's the movement going?" And then we started studying the way of peace, the way of love, studying the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. And they heard that had been a mass arrest in Nashville, that 89 students, black and white college students, had been arrested for sitting in. Dr. King would come, 10 rallies, speak on our behalf. And one day, he said to me, when you finish school, I want you to come and work for my organization. But when I finished American Baptist, I went on to Fisk University. But before going, I got involved in something called the Freedom Ride. Just think, in 1961, the year that President Barack Obama was born, black people and white people could be seated together on a Greyhound or Trailway bus, leaving Washington, D.C., leaving the nation's capital, and traveling through Virginia, through North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. We were on our way to New Orleans to test a decision of the United States Supreme Court. We were beaten, arrested, and jailed along the way. But we didn't give up. We kept the faith. We filled the city jail in Montgomery after we had been beaten. We filled the city jail in Birmingham. And I will never forget that many young people, many students and ministers and others, lawyers, came from their state to join the Freedom Rides in 1961. More than 400 of us were jailed. The city of Jackson. We filled the city jail in Jackson. Filled the county jail. And later we were transported to the state penitentiary, where most of us stayed up to almost 60 days. But President Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy intervened and got the Interstate Commerce Commission to issue an order by November the 1st, 1961. Those signs that said white waiting and colored waiting came tumbling down. So people said today, March, Book 1 is saying, when people said that nothing had changed, I feel like saying, come and walk in my shoes. The only places our children and their children will see those signs today will be in a book, in a museum, or on a video. We're not there yet, but we're on our way to creating one America, one people, one family, one house. There are forces in America today trying to take us back. We've come too far, we made too much progress to go back, and we're going forward. We're going forward. Dr. King spoke of redeeming the soul of America, creating a beloved community where we can lay down the burden of race and class. March is saying, in effect, that we're one people, that we're one family. We all live in the same house, not just the American house, but the world house.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter whether we're black or white, Latino, Asian American, Native American. We're one people. As the late A. Philip Randolph said, who was planning the March on Washington, he said it over and over again. Maybe our foremothers and our forefathers all came to this great land in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. Dr. King also said that we're one people, that we must learn to live together. If not, we will perish as fools. March is a book of hope. It's saying, in effect, what can be done. You know, we didn't have a website. We hadn't heard of the internet. Social media, what is that? but we used what we had to bring about a nonviolent revolution, a revolution of values, a revolution of ideas. And I said to each and every one of you here tonight, to never give up, to never give in. Be bold, be courageous, and find a way to get in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Sometimes I think that here during these unbelievable days in our country, that we are too quiet. We need to make a little noise. We need to push and pull. Look, some of my friends, some people that I march with and work with, men and women, black and white, gave their very lives for the right of all of us to participate in the democratic process. 3 young men that I knew, Andy Goodman, Mickey Schreiner, and James Chaney, gave their very lives on June 21st, 1964 in Mississippi. They really were riding in a car during voter registration work, went out to check on the burning of an African-American church. They were arrested, taken to jail, taken out of the jail, turned over to the Klan where they were beaten, shot, and murdered. There were other people who were beaten and murdered. People were asked to count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap, the number of jelly beans in a jar. On the march from Selma to Montgomery, the attempted march, I gave a little blood. Had a concussion there. I thought I was going to die. I thought I saw death. We succeeded because of what happened.
In our democracy,
President Lyndon Johnson introduced the Voting Rights Act. It was passed
for the cries of pain
and signed into law
and
on
the
August 6,
yells and
1965.
protests of oppressed people.
In closing, I said to each and every one of you, I truly believe that in a democratic society such as ours, the vote is precious. It is almost sacred. It is the most powerful, nonviolent instrument or tool we have, and we must use it. If we fail to use it, we will lose it. So on election day, I appeal to each and every one of you to go out and vote like we never voted before. We must vote. Stand up, speak up. You can do it. We must do it. And we must save our country and save democracy. Thank you very much. All in your hands.
How do you follow that? My name is Andrew Iden. I serve as digital director and policy advisor in the Congressman's office, which means I tweet for a living. You guys know hashtag good trouble? I know, there's one of you right there. Yeah. And I'm the co-author of March. And as the Congressman mentioned, it's my fault. This is fun. You guys have a great place here. We've been coming to, it's funny. We have a thing that sometimes I do, it's like a speech, and I'm just going to throw it out the window here for a second. Our entire plan for whether or not we could make March be accepted in the mainstream was based early on about whether or not it would do well here in San Diego. It was, could you be a hit at Comic-Con? And I had many a meeting before we came about what is it like when you bring a congressman to Comic-Con? John Lewis was the first. He's been the first at a lot of things, but nobody expected he'd be the first at Comic-Con. And to her credit, your congresswoman for Port of the City, Susan Davis, was the second. She came and visited us. And it's wild to look back on it now. I mean, it's been 5 years we've been on the road, 10 that we've been making these books. I mean, I was a young man when this started. See the gray, it's really coming in. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I need that. And I remember those days because I think about them a lot lately. It was a simpler time. Barack Obama was president. The Republicans were a mess, but nothing changes. And the big question we had, I mean, this is where it all started for me. I mean, if I'm totally honest, I started working for the congressman by answering his mail. Look at me now. And I remember so much of those early days in John Lewis's office were about how do we teach young people about the civil rights movement. I can remember that first campaign that I worked for the congressman where the big question was, what have you done for me lately? My answer was a lot. But people didn't understand that. And they didn't understand the civil rights movement. They didn't understand the role and the power that young people played in it. I didn't. I grew up in Atlanta. The congressman's been my congressman since I was 3 years old. Which is just like 5 or 10 years ago. I'm just running with it tonight. And I can remember going to the King Center many times as a young boy. My mom would take me, my school would take me, and they would tell you the stories about SCLC. They would tell you the story about, Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. They would tell you something that essentially has been boiled down to these days, which is 9 words. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, I have a dream. Right? And that is what, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the vast majority of students graduate from high school knowing about the civil rights movement. That's it, 9 words. And I'll never forget being on that campaign in 2008 and hearing for the first time in my life John Lewis tell the story of SNCC, 2 young people on the campaign trail. The story of what it was like during the sit-in movement. how Greensboro and Nashville were complementary movements that were happening at the same time, how the sit-in movement led into the stand-in movement to desegregate facilities like movie theaters, how the stand-in movement then became a part, or was a precursor to the Freedom Rides, and how the Freedom Rides were actually, well, it was the second Freedom Ride. We don't know about that either, right? Journey of Reconciliation happened in 1947. Bayard Rustin, who's the organizer of the March on Washington, he spent 21 days in a chain gang in Louisiana for it. All these things, and nobody had ever told me. And I was a little unhappy about that. Because I've been a rabble-rouser. Look, my father was a Muslim immigrant, which doesn't make me very popular. And I never knew him, to be honest. Everybody, they'll say like, oh, well, what's it like being a Muslim? I was like, actually, I was raised by a single mother who was a Methodist. Bit of a difference. And I grew up as this rabble-rouser because I saw how the world treated my mom, how they treated single mothers. Fundamentally unfair and just brutally mean. And I can remember being a young 10, 12 years old, going with my mom to things, seeing these old men insult my mother, saying, what are you doing? Where's your husband? He should be speaking for you. And I can remember, well, I'll speak for her. And then pushing me out of the way. And that built in me a social consciousness that in many ways led me into comics. Right? Okay, it makes sense. Just bear with me. Because I was reading comics because I needed role models. I needed an escape. And I was always a reader. But I wanted to read stories about people trying to do the right thing because it was the right thing to do. People who wanted to be heroes, who wanted to help other people. Not people who wanted to get rich, not people who wanted to be powerful, but people who wanted to make the world a better place. And to be fair, it was a lot of white men in tights. But it really, that's another issue. Thank you. And so when I went to work for the Congressman, taking this social justice, this social consciousness with me, and I'm on that campaign in 2008, and I'm hearing these stories for the first time, and my eyes are being opened. I keep thinking, how do we tell these stories? This is good stuff. People need to know this. And it was finally when it was coming down to the end of the campaign, when folks were starting to talk about what they were going to do afterwards. Some folks said they were going to go to the beach. Some folks said they were going to go see their parents. I said I was going to a comic book convention. Not to tell you that I cheat on you guys, but it was Dragon Con. I know. But I love Dragon Con. That was a lot of fun, right? It was just imagine 12, 13-year-old me just going to Dragon Con, right? I had a very tolerant mother. And when I said that on that campaign, everybody laughed at me. All these very prim and proper political types who'd spent 20 years in, prognosticating. And as they're laughing at me, I hear a deep voice. And it was Congressman Lewis. And he said, don't laugh. There was a comic book during the movement, and it was very influential. And I went home that night, and I looked it up on the internet. It was called Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. It was published in December of 1957, sold for 10 cents, although in many cases they gave it away for free. It was 16 pages cover to cover, 4-color, beautiful studio house style of the mid-50s. And I remember reading it on the internet that night and sitting on that couch and looking at it. All of this in my brain, all of the stories that I just heard from John Lewis, all of my own emotional baggage from life, wanting a hero, wanting a father, wanting someone to look up to, wanting a role model. And I remember sitting there thinking, there should be a John Lewis comic book. When the Congressman told you the rest, I was pretty stubborn. I can't imagine that, can you? And I just kept asking. I kept asking over and over, why don't you write a comic book? And it was funny to watch my colleagues dismiss it so wholeheartedly, to just completely miss that pitch as it went right by. They couldn't fathom it. And I've thought about that a lot since then. What can we learn from that? What can I learn from that? And that is, don't be the guy or the lady laughing at the kid with the idea. Listen. If they'd been smart, they would have just stolen it and gone and done the book themselves. But, thank God they're not smart. So why comics? Why does comics work for teaching the civil rights movement more so than other mediums? Why is it that this book and these books have taken off when there have been so many books published about the civil rights movement? Literally thousands of books have been published about the civil rights movement by icons of history, and yet March has outsold just about all of them. Why? Why? This is the big question. My theory, and I'm pretty confident in this, is the internet. And it's not what you think about the internet. It's not just because we can sell it on the internet. It's because the internet is changing the way we communicate. This generation of digital natives who have grown up on the internet, who have experienced their entire life communicating through screens, essentially communicate through sequential narrative. Words and pictures together. Twitter is a giant comic book when it comes down to it. Facebook is kind of like that crummy comic book you don't really want to read. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't follow. You really don't know who wrote it. Sorry, I can't. They're going to show up at the door. Zuckerberg's going to be like, no. But this is a serious point. The way we the way we communicate with people is changing because of this literacy. And I am not surprised at all it is the librarians who figured it out first. Because frankly, they're smarter than all of us. They know where the bodies are buried, and they can use the Dewey Decimal System to find them. Dewey Decimal jokes are the best. This is like the only crowd that would play in. Maybe the American Library Association, but that's about it. So what does this mean? So now we have this resource. Now it's starting to be in schools. I think for me, that's the biggest deal. Right? When I was in school, there were no comic books. I would get in trouble for having comics. But now we have this opportunity. And more than that, we have an opportunity to teach civil rights to a whole new generation. I don't think it's a coincidence that we fail to teach the civil rights movement. I don't think it's a coincidence that we fail to teach civil disobedience and nonviolence. If you take the power of the internet, the technology that we have, and you apply it to someone who is skilled in the discipline and philosophy of nonviolent civil disobedience, there is very little they can't accomplish. And I believe that you're seeing this generation now, 5 years after we started this journey, start to recognize their power. We've done reading programs like this all over the country. We love it. And the reason we always let the students ask the questions, the reason we always speak at schools as a part of it, is because we're trying to inspire a new nonviolent revolution among young people in America. And I think it's working. I look at what's happening today. You hear the word march more than you ever have before. You see students and young people who are building organizations, who are building presences online that allow them to respond and hold these giant events on a moment's notice. And I think it's just starting. I think we're going to see them get better, whether it is emulating the selective buying campaigns of Nashville and Montgomery, or marching on Washington as we've seen them, or dealing with the corporations who underwrite some of these people who we don't necessarily agree with. They're going to find their voice. It's only a matter of time. And all of you and me and our obligation is to help them, to give them things like March, to tell them that we support them, to show them the path forward, because they will be our salvation, our liberation. They are our future. But more than anything, they may be the only thing that pull us out of this dark hole that we're in right now. My mother died last year, and I miss her every day. In fact, when March won the 4 American Library Association Awards, which was the first time a book had ever done that, I missed it because I was with her in the hospital, and it was 2 days before she died. And I'm pretty convinced that she hung on that extra day and a half just so that she would be there when I actually was technically receiving them. Because for kids like me, there is no math that says I should be on this stage. There's no math that, the odds of me working for John Lewis, winning the National Book Award for a comic, are astronomical, except for one variable: my mother. So I say that to say we all have a role to play in someone's life. We don't know necessarily what it is at the outset, whether it is being a parent, a friend, a caretaker, a lover. We all have to take care of each other. And we all are facing tough times right now, and we're going to need each other to get through it. So take the lessons of March. Take the hope that John Lewis's life gives us and use them to build a better America, a more just country, a truly more perfect union. And to do that, I have to ask you all to join us and march. Thank you.
Now, for the first time, I will say, how do you follow that? We've done this a couple of times, maybe 300 or 400. That was your best set, man. That was very, very moving. That was some fire. Well, hey, y'all. I'm Nate Powell. I'm the artist of March. I make comics. How's it going? Hey. I've come to San Diego 11 times now, and this is the first time that it's not been for San Diego Comic Con, so thank you. Yes. I love San Diego Comic Con, so for whoever works for the con out there, see you soon. Okay, so I'm from Arkansas, and I was born in the late 70s. I also spent my elementary school years in Montgomery, Alabama. And my parents are baby boomers from northern Mississippi. A lot of my time spent on March was a reckoning with my entire lifetime. So growing up, being 7 or 8 in the mid-'80s, I did get a basic working knowledge of the civil rights movement. I mean basic, but it worked for me. And a lot of it was from my parents. historical information and personal anecdotes from their lives and growing up in the 50s and 60s in Mississippi. But it was interesting, and reflecting upon it with other fellow Southerners my age these days, my parents, like many of their peers, sort of capped off a lot of this information with an exception or a dismissal, like, oh, but that was a different time. That was way back there. Even as they're telling history that's like 10 to 15 years before I was born, in the exact city where I was standing. Kind of pulling Jedi mind tricks, like, these are not the droids they're looking for. You will let us pass. And I didn't have the vocabulary for it at the time, but all these things didn't add up because it seemed like a lot of effort increasingly was being put into that kind of dismissal, that kind of drawing a line of unreality, where these were two segments of history that did not have a thread that ran through it. Yes, and this is the core of the problem. The core of the problem that I think a lot of white Generation Xers and older millennials have carried with them. And even like in Montgomery, I had spent a good amount of time visiting a lot of these locations and sites, stuff that had happened 3 miles from my house. And yet, and watching grainy black and white footage and video of these moments happening, and yet recognizing that there was this unsettling quality to trying in the efforts to show that somehow there was not a continuum, that these in fact were folks who couldn't or perhaps weren't your neighbors, your family members, your friends, who couldn't have been you in another world, in another time and place, or in the same place, different time. So a lot of my efforts on March became an effort to reckon with that tension, with that intergenerational anxiety, but also to destroy that layer of abstraction. And a lot of that I carried into my life all the way to like age 34, 35, before I was really able to unpack the last of that baggage. So I started drawing comics when I was 12 in 1990. A couple years later, I started self-publishing them. And it's incredible for March to be a part of comics' larger struggle for legitimizing itself in American pop culture, but also in the literary canon. It's amazing to be able to stake out some ground and in some ways squash a little bit of that debate. But I always find that debate itself always comes charged with this very polarizing thing. It's like you can either, people feel the need to assert that that in order to embrace higher literary efforts in comics, it involves separating itself from the spandex. But I really need to take a moment, as I do every single time, to stick up for the spandex. It was Chris Claremont and Ann Nocenti's runs. That's right, I brought Annie Nocenti up in here. For the 4 people who care, a fantastic superhero writer. It was their runs on X-Men and the X titles in the 1980s that gave me a social conscience and a potent combination with punk music and thrash metal, a lot of it incidentally from the San Diego area in the late 80s and 90s. So thank you, San Diego. But, X-Men really helped provide a lens through which I saw racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, nationalism in the world around me, in my town, in my school, in my heart, in a way that made it fresh, that made it raw, that made it something to reckon with. And it was something that I was able to take, out of my superhero realm and sort of empowered by angry, hopeful, creative people making loud music in basements and garages. Eventually, the comics I made sort of wound those two concepts together tightly until, in many ways, I feel like March was a synthesis of my entire life when the time came to do it, not just reckoning with where and when I came from, but what it is I chose to do, the ideals I chose to pursue, the questions I wanted to ask, and the things that I wanted to see. I think that when it came time to unpack the last of that baggage and reckon with what hadn't been dealt with in terms of learning about our shared history and the history of the pursuit for justice and the history of reckoning with inequality and injustice, it sort of shocked me the degree to which I was carrying my parents' generation's assumptions that the relatively basic civil and legal gains that were essential, established through the efforts of the civil rights movement, were universally accepted, period. And it's really nice to see, the tens of thousands of retweets of the statistics of polls, gauging Dr. King's popularity throughout America at large in the mid-1960s. And it's it is a shocker. But it's important to recognize the situation on the ground at the time and the amount of pressure, the amount of perseverance necessary to turn the tide of America at large. So yes, everyone needs a good civil rights education. And we need to show it in context with struggles for women's rights, for workers' rights, for LGBTQ rights, for immigrants' families' rights. These things are interconnected. And it's not just a matter of presenting the history itself. Another assumption I carried way too late in life, some of that had to do with being like a snooty author, and I make my comics and somebody prints them and they show up on a bookshelf and people read them. I didn't know how that stuff worked, and I didn't pay attention to the gatekeepers sometimes taking fairly large risks to get books in people's hands, to get books into classrooms, into libraries. But it's not just a matter of presenting the history and making it available. It's not just about letting people see heroes who look like them, though that's very important. It's about seeing connections between seemingly different struggles and then understanding equality as being in everyone's interest. And that is a very dangerous idea to those in power, and we all know it. So when we, I mean like the big we, though, this is our contribution. This is my contribution. I'm not going to be speaking for folks who may have contributed a little bit more over the years. But when we provide that rich history, we disrupt the 9-word problem in whichever ways we can. And by that I mean we disrupt the defanged narrative of leaders passing change down from the mountaintop. And I knew that in my head, but I kept a lot of that so internalized just from the way baby boomer Mississippi grounded into me as a kid. When we provide that rich history, what is told is millions of hours of thankless, often pretty boring work behind the scenes to make these larger gains occur. What is told are divergent, sometimes oppositional ideas, philosophical schisms, strong differences in the strategies and the tactics, in the existence of capital N nonviolence itself. It was fascinating to draw a march and along the ways of books 2 and book 3 to see this thread of these philosophical shifts occurring, very heated arguments at times. But the people involved in those arguments and discussions getting back together and meeting in the streets where they all needed to be because they did have a common objective besides considerable differences along the way. What is told is a crucial example of intergenerational reckoning. I think that I was maybe the most oblivious to the ways in which the civil rights movement, as we know it, yes, was a broad, sustained struggle against forces of institutional inequality in our country at large, but it was also an intergenerational struggle within the civil rights movement itself. So only by recognizing, and some of this is like literally drawing the youth involved of teenage and young 20-something John Lewis and his peers and his friends, Recognizing that youth and how it comes out made me understand for the first time the smaller generational gulf between Congressman Lewis and Dr. King, and then recognizing that larger generational gulf that went back to the Thurgood Marshalls of the first half of 20th century civil rights struggles. What is told is the value of, or the essential role played by dedicated journalists and by a free press in recognizing, and that's really easy to get lost in the mix. But a lot of this is just like whether it's in the details of the script or in the details of the reference material. But what's funny is, like the first, so March Book 1, going from young John Lewis as a boy on a rural Alabama farm, emerging into the rising sit-in movement in Nashville. But the lower quantity of reference material I had, at a certain point, forced me to ask the question, why? Why do I have more free reign, artistically speaking, to fill in some of the gaps and to tell the story in a particular way? And as I was moving into the Freedom Rides, moving into the March on Washington, and especially moving into the Selma movement, the situation on a creative level really tightened. There was a lot more accountability and responsibility. And the reason why is simply there are more cameras on the scene. There are more reporters covering it. It's showing up in more TV screens across the country. And it is only by those journalists showing up and covering it that the movement, that the struggle was put into people's living rooms all across America, that otherwise relatively comfortable people could be driven by either their conscience or by pressure to admit to a fundamental injustice and to play some role in rectifying it. So, thank you, Free Press. And I guess at its most basic level, what is told is that inequality is not something that is fixed once. The arc of the moral universe may bend towards justice, but it only bends towards justice when we bend it. And we all know that. We all know it now. So immediately upon getting my own reference together and reading Walking with the Wind to prepare for Drawing March, I immediately identified with John Lewis as a 6-year-old. And I grew up 40 miles up the old Troy Highway from where Congressman Lewis grew up. Different generation, very different circumstances, but it was the intensity, the gravity through which he viewed the world around him that I experienced very vividly as a 6-year-old at all. That awareness of fairness and injustice and the way that he perceived and dealt with it. I can see it in my own 6-year-old very clearly now. And I think that, in general, we all experience that level of intensity as 6-year-olds. I think the structures and the systems which surround us and contain us spend a lot of effort and resources to whittle away at that sensitivity day by day, year by year. And it's important to be able to pull out that sensitivity whenever possible. It's what binds us, and it's what allows us to actually get in the streets together. And I guess my final point is just that I'm really proud and honored to have been able to spend so much of my adult life making this work. It's doubly important now as a parent, but in the larger social sense, to be able to set out an example to say, here, plainly, here's what a thoughtful, committed group of 20-year-olds did to shape the fabric of our country. Not despite being 20, but specifically because they were 20. So, if anyone out there is under the age of 20, the challenge then is, what will you do when you are 20? And the good news is, you get to determine that. But this is not a drill, and it never was. But we all know that now, don't we? Thank you, y'all.